I'm a monster, yup, I'm a monster. Ricky and the monster, your boy. It's the return of a big fish piranha, running the entire show. President, run in the city. London, you with me? Now, who's the one with the boom?
I'm British and Japanese. I grew up in Cornwall in St Ives. It's like a very art historical seaside village, very quaint and kitschy and full of tourists. And they built a Tate museum there when I was 11 years old. It was very funny because the local people wanted a swimming pool, a public swimming pool, even though there's the most beautiful beaches in England there. And I just remember someone coming to the door with a petition saying, you know, we don't want this Tate to come here, we want this swimming pool. And it was kind of strange to have this super brand museum arriving in this town that until then was really not on the map so much. Of course, it has this incredible history of art in St Ives, but I can't say I was influenced by that at all, because everything I saw in that museum was completely irrelevant to me. It was abstract expressionism and formal sculpture. So I think just the presence of some kind of art might have affected me, but actually it was the YBAs which were the biggest influence, because people like Tracy Emin, who would end up on the front of newspapers, and in England at the time it was very conservative. Where I grew up, it was completely white, quite poor, and the idea of a woman coming from the seaside speaking about being raped and having abortions and all these crazy stories, and then ending up as some kind of figure of high culture was incredibly inspiring to me, because it was a way I saw that the system could be short-circuited, and even though the press was generally derogatory about it, it was still becoming part of a narrative which was so refreshing in England at the time. So I kind of grew up experiencing everything through media, mediated. It was before the internet, but I relied on these newspapers. I would cut out the pictures of these works from newspapers, and it was so exciting to know about this other world. It was an incredibly boring place, and I'm so thankful for that, because I think that everywhere I've known in my life that my life will never be as boring again, and I'll never move back. So I think that's how I discovered art in a way, and I always thought of it then as some kind of way of agitating or shaking up or rethinking real life and society, because I think that's exactly the effect it had on me. It was never sort of formal game or anything about how art is made, or you know, what painting means or sculpture means. Those things never interested me when I was young. So Harrow School is an elite English all-boys boarding school. It's a kind of fairy tale looking place, straight out of Harry Potter, and it's the school that I went to for 2 years when I was 16 to 18. They take every year a local underprivileged, preferably ethnic minority and preferably gay, I guess, student, and I was the student that got the place that year, and my life was transformed by it, as in a kind of game show, I guess you could say, and found myself in this environment that was utterly unlike anything I'd known before. That was where, you know, through the kind of luxury of that situation, I was making art. I was able to really explore things that I was interested in, and I, you know, had keys to the art school and as much oil paint as I wanted, and it was a fantasy for me. And that was where I met Joanne, who had also arrived the same year that I came, having won the Miss Northern Ireland beauty competition beauty pageant, which she then used to help her go through art school in Northern Ireland before she became a teacher. So she was quite a young teacher when she came to Harrow. And I think that we bonded because we were both arriving in this strange place, very much from the outside. And I think we're trying to navigate it somehow in the safety of the art department.
I feel like I'm cheating if I say I am a model, I am a teacher, I am a boxer, I'm an artist, I am a beauty queen. I feel like I'm nothing, even though I'm all of that and more.
At the time, I think the same themes that I'm working with now are the themes that I was interested back then. It was image and visual culture. I think it was, I look at young people today who are incredibly image literate. They're producing their own videos and editing images of themselves and things, and they're aware of like color, temperature, and focus, and all these things that would have been really sophisticated for me at the time, but it was, I guess, a prototype version of the internet kids today. It was ID magazine and all these hip magazines at the time that were, in the late 90s, were really excited and pushing and promoting like diversity and difference, and those are the things that really, really excited me. So a lot of my work were actually centering around remaking fashion imagery in oil paints and painting my friends. But already there was a presence of a lot of the female figure in those works, but perhaps not in a classical female figure study way, but more as images and what they mean. And I think with Joanne, what's so interesting and strange is that we talked a lot about her life as having been a beauty queen, and then being an artist. And being a beauty queen is a highly objectifying process, a self-elected objectification. And being an artist, you are often objectifying. You're trying to turn the world around you into an object, an image, a static thing, frozen. And there was a kind of conflict for her in that is, how much am I an object and how much am I objectifying? And that was something we discussed, and I think was already somehow generative to the way I thought at that time, even when I was 16. But I think this is also, all things that I realized in the wake of making the work Joanne. So how much of it I remember or how much of it I've invented, I'm not entirely sure.
Reviewing past press, it all starts at 98 when you won the Miss Northern Ireland competition. After that, it's mostly sort of focused on your relationship. So not so much a focus about you as Joanne, but more Joanne, the girlfriend. From then on, we have the scandal that happened in Harrow. Over a decade after I left Harrow, I had lost touch with Joanne, and then I started to see articles and things in the news about Joanne, and it was about a scandal, a kind of a topless scandal in which photographs of her topless were circulating in the national media in Britain, and they were photographs taken by a female photography teacher at the school that somehow found their way onto a memory stick that was left in a photography department. And it being an all-boys school, the boy that discovered this was incredibly excited, I guess, put it on the server, and by the end of the day, this was at the headquarters of the national papers, and it was the perfect tabloid story of its time. It had all of these high and low things, a beauty queen, an elite school with royal kids, and this kind of sexual scandal
despite the fact that they're very unsexual images, and but it was a kind of perfect storm in a way, and perfect for its time. It was a pre social media time, so it was a time when people were really selling papers, and this kind of story would sell very well, and this really was incredibly difficult for Joanne, as she's described to me, trying to face students then in this all-boys environment, having had this transgression put upon her, and she was not able to teach anymore. The press were kind of completely hounding her, staking out outside her apartment, those kind of things you see in movies. And I heard about this, and at the time I found it incredibly ironic, perverse, surreal, because many of the things we'd been discussing actually about how people and women especially were represented in the media were actually happening to her in her real life, the things we talked about over a decade before, and in a way that just played out in the most cliched way, that were casting her as this this perverse sexual thing that had come in and tainted the purity of this elite boys' school. And it was a class story, it was a misogynistic story, and I immediately started thinking about a project with her. But it wasn't until 3 or 4 years after the event that I contacted her and went to meet her, and wanted to ask her if she would be interested in embarking on some kind of work that explored this, but at that point it was completely open. The only criteria, I guess, was that I had a commission from a production company in England, the Film and Video Umbrella, and had a budget to make a film, and that was where we began in our conversations.
How are you doing?
It's not edited, it's not scripted,
Authentic and natural.
He's such a tomboy.
So he's done this painting
The largest mural I've painted.
for this amazing space.
And then this is when I won Miss Northern
Oh
Ireland.
my goodness, dessert has just arrived.
First ever photo shoot.
Yummy.
What a happy moment. Graduated from art school. Fancy dress night. Cleopatra. First TV presenting job. Cycle for charity. That was my job at Harrow when I started.
It's really hard to let go as well. I just can't keep going the way I'm going, and I'm reaching out for something to happen, and I've got such hope that there's something so good ahead.
The first meeting with Joanne after, I think it was almost 14 years at this point, was very strange for me, and it became the cornerstone or my guiding light for making the work. I remember walking into the kitchen and seeing her again, and having known her for many years and worked closely with her personally, was shocked to find myself looking at her in a completely alien way. I just couldn't believe the way she looked. She looked like so photoshopped in real life. She was so perfect looking, and everything she was standing by in the kitchen looked to me like a product, like almost like she was selling this. And I was so shocked by the violence of my own gaze on her, completely commodifying her. And especially, I'm someone that considers myself, I don't consider myself as a misogynist. I can say I don't consider myself someone that actively wants to objectify people, and I'm gay, so I don't have any sexual interest in her, and yet I found myself looking at her in a way that I wasn't sure how exactly I'd come about to have this way of approaching her, and I realized how colonized I was by images of women in advertising, in the media constantly, that I myself had been indoctrinated against my own better knowledge into a way of looking at the world. And her beauty was a huge barrier immediately. And I was clear from the start then that it would be entirely disingenuous to make a film that didn't deal with that, because that is this product nature of Joanne's biology is in many ways at the crux of the way in which she becomes an image and became distributed, and therefore became this press sensation that was selling newspapers. And I really wanted to use that experience that I had as a way to speak very honestly about, I think, why these things happen and why they repeatedly happen, and not try to give some kind of positive glow on the situation, not to try to make a comforting story about beauty is only skin deep and we're all the same deep down and we all have the same experiences, and it's just not the case. And as I started making the work, I stepped into a completely different reality. You know, we spent months together working, and I would walk down the street with her, and you know, every male head would turn and look at her, and I realized that the reality that Joanne inhabits, purely from the shell that she is in, the aesthetic, is entirely different to my reality, and that we are many people on the planet and we all live extremely different realities. So I wanted to make a work that was rooted firmly in her reality, certainly on the aesthetic level. And from the start, I was very clear with Joanne that this is not a work that is about, you know, this is not a work that will save her or will, you know, transform her life. This is not the game show. But it was also, from the start, a collaboration, in the sense that I wanted to know what would Joanne need from a film. What tools does she want? Because we're dealing with an image that she can't get rid of. The image, the topless image of her, she doesn't own it, and she can't take it off the internet. So it's still circulating. So from the beginning, we knew that the framework for the work was actually a battle against this image, and could we obliterate this original image with more images? And that was when we started to think, well, maybe we should actually explore what it would take to try to flood the market with more images, and to see if it would be possible to at least knock that one image off its number one peg, and if that's not possible, to put it in a landscape of other images of Joanne that at least balance out or can confuse people enough to not really know if that original image is authentic or not. And so we approached people in the advertising industry, people in marketing, people in the influencer and Instagram and YouTube world.
Our approach very much was to think about you as a product, and by that using the techniques that we would also use in launching a product.
And we wanted to understand what it takes to recreate your image, what it takes to rebrand yourself, and in this specific situation. And in one of the early meetings with a media company, we were looking at the landscape in which that Joanne had been positioned, purely in a media sense and not in a personal way. And the company offered two choices. They said to Joanne, you can do two things. You can give everything to combat this. You can go on Instagram, go on Twitter, go on Facebook, just interview, talk about yourself, do selfies, do videos, authenticity, intimacy, but create a new audience that's so close to you that they'll never believe in those topless images, and you'll create a whole new, more authentic person. Or your other option is to just disappear, just don't be photographed anymore, move away, stay out of the limelight. And this was 2016, just before the Me Too campaign. But I said to the company, can I just be clear? What we're saying in 2016 is that a woman that is in this media profile has two options, which is the virgin or the whore. And essentially they said yes, these are her options in the media landscape.
Hi.
Hi.
How are you doing? Joanne.
Nice to meet you. I'm Joe as well.
So thank you for coming today. You're going to be the brand manager. So what we'll do is start here. I'll just run through perhaps what I'd like you to say, if that's okay.
We're not talking about her as a human being, but you've come to us with this specific problem. And that was incredibly refreshing to me to hear what the truth is in certain worlds of the mechanics. Because when you understand what the truth is, you can understand how to manipulate it or work against it or work with it. And you're not in a position of naivety around the material you're working with. And so all of these experiences and influences kind of started to build the language of the film, where I was taking references from these very people that were constructing other people's images. Speaking to the cinematographer about how advertising is currently being shot and what kind of language is used. The word authentic keeps appearing. What is authentic? The sun is authentic, so the sun has to be in every image. What is authentic? Handheld cinematography, that you have the sense of a presence of a person looking at the person on camera, shaky camera. But most interesting was when it got really technical, which was the discussion about how we want to shoot Joanne, because we understood that this film, in her real life, could in fact change something. It will certainly be picked up by the mainstream media, so it could have a real effect. And how do we want people to view her in this new light? And Jamie introduced me to the notion of the hero shot, which is a shot that's just 5 degrees under the eye line of the protagonist. And this is a position, a technical position in which the protagonist appears slightly larger than you, and therefore someone that's aspirational, believable, authoritative, and yet just, but undetectably so that they're still relatable, and they feel like you're in a dialogue with them. All of these forms and tools and techniques that I started to learn through the process of making this work, and in a way that wasn't about enjoying the formalism of these, but actually the purpose of them, a real life purpose for Joanne, led me to a kind of major understanding in my work in general, which is the idea of hyper-immersion, or hyper-engagement, I call it. And this is perhaps one of the kind of main examples of a work of mine that deals with this idea of hyper-engagement with capitalism, hyper-engagement with media, with dominant cultural forms that surround us in everyday life. And for me, coming from image generation, an internet generation, a finished world, you could say, where all products have been made and all discoveries have been made. I was, of course, like many people of my generation, having frustrations about how is it possible to interact with this world, which is presented to us as closed. It's presented to us as a series of products, and I realized through the process of making this work that you can hyper-engage. You can really find out and discover how this world functions and how it's put together, and then use those same tools for your own ends, because the basics of them, creating this kind of imagery, incredibly appealing imagery, playing, manipulating how people look at a picture and bolstering colours or the ways that the figure looks at you, are all art historical forms that painters have been doing for centuries. There's nothing inherently good or inherently bad about this fraud or this manipulation. It's just that those techniques have been hijacked by companies and corporations, and today we all very well know what the effect of that is. But there's no way back out of that, and the question for my generation is very much where to go with that and what to do inside that. And I'm too much of a coward and a narcissist to act politically in real life. I find it too embarrassing to position myself in any kind of political zone, and that's definitely a negative quality for a human being. But for me as an artist, it's a generative quality, and finding myself being able to slip into and out of these different worlds reveals something, in fact, very human about this process and this project, which is at the very root of every mechanized, industrialized, corporatized industry. There is an attempt to describe humanity and present humans. And with Joanne, one of the perverse questions, I think, that arose, especially in relation to our kind of social media times, which is to think about how for a new generation who grow up on Instagram, there is a kind of dream that in the past it would be to be a rock star or an astronaut, and now it would be to be an influencer. And what is that dream? It's to make everything in your life count. So, that you're just living is your primary market. So it's just waking up, documenting your breakfast, giving your every thought, going on your way to school, skateboarding, whatever it is, that can gain millions of views and that can create a market and endorsements, and that your life, just living, is a huge money-making, is your job. And I would describe that crudely as a major question, perhaps, of our century, which is how do I go from being a human to being a brand? And with Joanne, we have the opposite, which is how do I go from being a brand back to being a human? And I think that's the struggle that you see in the video in many ways, which is to say perhaps it's not possible to debrand yourself once you've been branded. And so the only tools that someone who has been branded have are more branding techniques.
Ever since I was very young, I've projected a particular persona. The carefree Joanne. It's almost like I've been just very good at hiding pain. I'm an actress. I play a role.
This is certainly not a cynical way of thinking about it, but it's an example, perhaps. Joanne is an example of a direction that I see that we're all going in societally, a direction where we are willingly self-objectifying. We're willingly posting our topless images. We're willingly posting the intimacy, our children, our private lives online. And I have no judgment of that. I'm just incredibly curious about what that will mean for us in the coming years. And so much of my work is a process of kind of live anthropology, you could say, where I'm trying to honor and document and record the things that are happening right now around me, because I think it's a revolution that we're living in. It's just not the revolution that we think we wanted, which is where the peasants come and knock down the palace gates and, steal the cake from Versailles. It's a much more undercover revolution. Yet it is a revolution in which the masses have a kind of control, which is the ability to document and present themselves. And again, with Joanne, the media scandal happened some years before Facebook and Instagram got big. So there was a shift in times, and had that image come out now, she would have had so many more tools to fight it in real time. But she didn't at that time. And the mainstream press was all powerful. So there are good things, there are bad things, there are weird things about it. The key, I suppose, in the end, in the process of making the work, there were I spoke to different people about it, and I was very scared and nervous because of the responsibility of dealing with someone else's life. And knowing that I wasn't going to make a documentary that explains everything, or even a work that takes sides, And it certainly is not a feminist film, I think, in a classic sense. And yet, what was so interesting was how many people had such strong opinions about Joanne, having never even met her. But she became symbolized and objectified even with the intelligentsia, the more liberal-minded feminists, and all these different groups of people and friends that I discussed the project with. And I realized that just simply because of the way she looked and this victim story that she had, she was again even being passed around as a totem to be filled with people's desires. There was a real desire from some parts to make a film that really fought back against the system, and Joanne would be used as this weapon. And I just was clear that I didn't want to ever deal with Joanne personally, but keep her in the realm of the object, of the image, of the transactory product that is at the core of the problem. And through this, I started to think about her aesthetics and think about her place in an art museum. Of course, when we look at the exhibition, it looks something maybe more like a pop-up store or something you'd see in a high street fashion, a mid-level high street fashion shop. And this really made me think about the aesthetics of art, of what we accept in museums, and it feels somehow shocking and unacceptable to see this kind of hyper-commercialized imagery in a space that we feel is reserved for a non-commercial purpose, or something that is deeper or truer and more philosophical and more artistic. And what does that look like? And I realized in the reactions to the work, there was some pushback about the aesthetic, that it was not meaningful enough or political looking enough. And what was so important for me was to sublimate all of the politics into this kind of imagery, which I believe is hyper-political because of its recontextualization. And simply by putting an image of someone that perhaps we say, yeah, okay, this incredibly commercial beauty that we see in every billboard around the world doesn't belong in a museum. She has enough airtime in the outside world. I found it quite perverse to bring that into a space where we believe, it's the most accepting space of all, the museum. Every kind of person is welcome, and yet the people that are most represented are not. And there's an important reason for our impulse towards that, but I realize how much we're still dependent on aesthetics and how much value and taste are attached to that. And so part of the exhibition was about trying to make the visitor experience as seamless as possible, as if you've just seen this so many times in your life, it's invisible, so that when you watch the film and the fragments of the story start to emerge and you start to reflect on that, there's a crux, a conflict at the base of the work and of the experience. So many people ask me about how Joanne is and what was the effect on her life, and I say, she's Joanne Sally, she's on social media, she's available, she's alive, and I'm not representing her in any way as a human being in this work. If you're interested in her as a human, you are at complete liberty to contact her. The problem is most people are never interested enough to go through the effort of creating a relationship with someone that they don't know, to find out all of these intimate things that they want to know. And we're so used to finding out incredibly intimate things from people we have no relationship to. So it feels normal to be asking this. I think, of course, the work, I'm aware that the work plays on this, plays on your desire to know these things, but it is essentially a pornographic desire. It's a one-way relationship in which you want to gain private information without giving anything of yourself. So this is why, I never speak about Joanne privately. For me, it's a way to respect her and to also protect the artwork, which is to say, this is a work in which an incredibly brave person, Joanne, gave her life and her story, or a part of it, to speak about something endemic, something bigger, and something, in fact, philosophical, which on one level you could say is the simplest story, the oldest story of time, which is a beautiful woman that the world wants to destroy. That's what the work is at its core. But in another setting, to perhaps degender it, it is about why do we as humans want so much to look at other humans and to freeze ourselves in time, to document ourselves, and to make ourselves into things. And that is sort of the question at the root of this and most of my work. It was pointed out to me that so many of the subjects and protagonists in my work are women, and it was never a conscious decision at all, but I've worked with Joanne, of course, with Anne Frank extensively. With Anne Frank, it was accidental. It came through an architectural interest. In fact, it was a visit to the Anne Frank house that developed into a project that I've been working on over 3 years, in which I rebuilt the Anne Frank house as a kind of traveling version in Israel and in Austria. And it was a project that became a sort of exploration of the way in which Anne has been created as a mass media icon, as a product, as a symbol, and how she's then distributed and what she's used for. For me, for many years I only worked with the symbolism around Anne Frank, and to give you examples, the things like miniature models of the Anne Frank house that are produced and sold by the Anne Frank house, and products and merchandise that come from it, the films that are made, why the house was bought in Amsterdam even after the Hollywood film was made, about celebrity visitors to the Anne Frank house and the products and traces they leave behind. I felt it was impossible to work with Anne as a body until I visited Madame Tussauds in Berlin. There I encountered a wax figure of Anne Frank. You walk in, it's in a really historic part of Berlin, just near the Brandenburg Gate, and you walk into the Madame Tussauds. It's a famous international wax museum with celebrities. You see Liza Minnelli singing "Willkommen, Bienvenue to Berlin." You turn and you see Anne Frank writing at her desk, looking at you, and then a few steps away is Hitler in a kind of bunker situation. And this was the first time I encountered Anne Frank's body, a three-dimensional color rendering of Anne. And it was incredibly uncanny for me, having worked with her so much, to kind of meet her. And I spent some time observing how people interacted with this figure. And of course, tourists would come, and the young girls who had read the diary would run up and put their arm on Anne and be photographed, and their dads would have their big tourist cameras and take photos of Anne Frank. And I kind of observed this over and over again, and while I was looking at the figure, I thought, well, I've looked at so many images of Anne Frank, and I've never seen this particular pose of her sitting at the desk in this way, looking at this angle. I wondered about the design behind this figure. Already a really weird idea, designing Anne Frank, choosing her skin colour, her hair colour, her eye colour, because we only have black and white images of her. And it dawned on me as I watched people interact with this figure that she'd been designed to look into a camera held by an adult man, an average height adult man. And this was confirmed to me when I scrolled through the hashtag Anne Frank, Madame Tussauds, that in every single image, Anne was looking right at the camera. And I realized at that point that, of course, she'd been designed to hyper-engage with her audience. A horrific thing to think of this person frozen in time, constantly performing, but not untruthful in terms of the reality of the legacy of this young girl that symbolizes so many things, but one of the main things I suppose you could say is hope. And so I found a way into working with her body, I suppose, by seeing the way the world had already treated her. And so I made a work called Likeness, and it's a video work, which is a kind of a work in which my own designed version of Anne Frank, as a wax figure, is interacting with a robotic camera. And it's a work in which the audience, the viewer, experiences alien eye looking at a puppet, looking at an object, hyper-objectified version of Anne. And is perhaps made aware, like I was, of the transactional nature of her as an image, and where we stand, what stakes we have. And many people in the process of looking at that realize how much she means to them subconsciously, but also not really understanding why, because again, it's a figure that is so much in our landscape that we are taught that this is an incredibly important person. That was one way in which I found a way to work with the body of someone, a woman, a girl, a victim, that I could never have imagined before. So with all my work, it's always a process of looking and discovering and being completely surprised by what other people do with stuff. For me, it's a way of stepping outside of my body, outside of the poverty of my reality, of the poverty of the individual experience, of how we can only see things from our own position, our own politics, our own histories. And it's so important for me to make work about and using other people, because especially today, where increasingly in the chaos of the politics we inhabit, it's impossible to think or speak about other people's realities, and to only be able to authentically speak about our own experiences and ourselves. And this creates a society of monologues, which sometimes really interesting monologues and sometimes less interesting monologues. But everything important I have learned in my life, I've learned through immersion and surprise and relationality, and it's the most painful way, but it's the way that I've come to understand certainly how to make work, and so I guess if in any way my work is political, I would say it is that, because it is of the polis of the people, and it's a question of how do we relate with each other and in the world that we've created. I was attracted to Marie Antoinette from architecture school, actually. I studied architecture, and in one of the lectures we were shown the Hameau de la Reine, which is a miniature fantasy farm that Marie Antoinette had built inside the gates of Versailles, where she would live as a peasant and enact, with the help of actor peasants, I guess you could say, a rural life. I suppose to counteract the life that she had inherited, which was entering a finished world. Versailles was kind of, I guess, like entering the Apple headquarters of its time. You know, every chandelier, every mirror, every painting was perfect. And what could she contribute to that? And why am I interested in this fantasy farm? I think what Marie Antoinette was touching on was an incredibly contemporary or modern way of thinking, which is a way that has become how we all live now, and what we all want as urbanites. We want our little farm in the city. We want our rural escape in 1 hour by a low-cost airline, and what she represented as a royal, as an elite, has become a full kind of democratic experience. And so I started to look into Marie Antoinette, and I didn't find anything in the media that I liked or was interested by. The films, the dominant narrative about her is this money-grabbing, extremely overspending girl, often, that was lost. And I just thought, whether she knew it or not, she represented something that was that really affected society. And one of the really interesting connections that I started to make with Marie Antoinette and Joanne, in fact, was the relationship to technology. Marie Antoinette was living in an age in which a new technology had become very cheap and in the hands of many, and that was printing. The print press became widely available, and so Marie Antoinette was one of the first royals that many people could see, because there were cheap prints of her flooding the market, the squares in Paris. And so, yes, we talk about her, how obsessed with her own image she was, Marie Antoinette, but it was an image that was communicated to millions of people, or maybe hundreds of thousands. And in this sense, she was an early celebrity, and a woman who was clearly understanding her role as an objectified person, or perhaps not understanding it, but starting to live in the world that we have now. As the revolution kind of took a stronghold and discontent among the masses with the royal family, libelles were produced, which are pornographic images that were cheaply printed of Marie Antoinette in all kinds of sexual scenarios, but very graphic. And this, of course, had an effect of tarnishing her image, because with a largely illiterate population, this image would have been very powerful and persuasive. That, coupled with several other strange connections, her relationship with Madame Tussauds, the original woman who created the Madame Tussauds empire, also started to draw these strange parallels for me, or these connections with my work. Madame Tussauds lived in Versailles, allegedly, was a contemporary of Marie Antoinette, made flowers for the Palace of Versailles. And as the revolution took shape, Marie Tussauds was, of course, under threat of being guillotined for her relationship with the royal family. And she struck a deal with the revolutionaries that if she would be kept alive, she would make wax renderings of all of the nobility that were being beheaded to record them somehow in time. And so she was allowed to live. She would bribe the executioners, get the fresh heads and cast them, including her boss, Marie Antoinette. So incredibly gruesome process. And Marie Tussauds moved to England. She left France. And again, this coincided with the Enlightenment, and the first time, you could say in history, to simplify it, that people started to become individuals and say, hey, I matter, what do I want to do today? And when people become individuals, they start to want things for themselves, and the entertainment industry started to grow at this period, and it coincided with Marie Tussauds opening her apartment on Baker Street with all of the wax heads of the French royal family, which people would then pay to come and see. So subconsciously or unconsciously, I realized that over the last few years, I have somehow been tracing some kind of history through these three women, through Marie Antoinette, through Anne Frank, and through Joanne, that perhaps expose or put a light on how we got to the world we got to today, how we created this world that we inhabit, a world that is often talked about as chaos and confusing and out of our hands or runaway or inhuman, saturated, image-obsessed, narcissistic. There are, in my mind, clear steps as to how we got there and why we got there, and in fact a logic that sort of describes the fact that we want to be here because we have systematically created this world, and it's incidental, I suppose, that it's through these women that have kind of guided me to this point. But it's, of course, not in any way surprising when you think that, of course, women have always been objectified. So this question now that we all face as women and men increasingly of wanting to voluntarily become objects, or to put ourselves on markets and distribute ourselves, originates in women. So I don't know if this is something that I'm going to continue to look at, because it's not something that I knew I was interested in before. But it's definitely something that I see emerging culturally, and something that I don't see changing for a long time.
See you walking